Yeah, I'm Michael DiGiovine, Associate Professor of Anthropology. I'm also the Director of our Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in our Museum Studies program. I really thank you for having me here today. This is actually an edited volume, so I've published monographs before, but this is actually an edited volume. So just to your point, Crystal, we've brought in a number of senior scholars and junior scholars to publish chapters. All of them are practitioners. Professors and practitioners in study abroad. Most of them are anthropologists, but not all of them. We have environmental scientists, creative writing people as well. So it's a little bit interdisciplinary, although it does focus more on anthropology. And it's also I have a book series. So I'm an editor of a book series with Roman Littlefield in Lexington Books called The Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society. So again, I'm happy to answer that question at the end as well about how you get published, because I've done a lot of that. I come to this as a cultural anthropologist, particularly a scholar of mobility, global mobility, so tourism, pilgrimage, and study abroad, as well as heritage. I run an interest group, the Anthropology of Tourism interest group at the American Anthropological Association, edit the book series, do all that kind of stuff. But what for all of my work, and this is my first book when I was also a grad student, my first monograph, all of my work has come from being a practitioner first, and then going in and being a researcher as well. So I was a tour operator back in the 2000s after I graduated college, and that really shaped everything that I've done and my approach to tourism and global mobilities. I'm a practicing Catholic, so happy Easter Triduum. It's coming up, and I've done a lot of Catholic pilgrimage studies and spoken here before on that. And then became an anthropologist and an ethnographer, where we do participant observation. So it's kind of like study abroad anyway. But in particular to study abroad, I've approached this in my work with three perspectives. I was a student first. My mom actually helped run a study abroad program through Randall College in New Jersey to Urbino. My first son was born not too far away from that city. On the top there, I studied abroad for a year at the University of Bologna when I was in college. Thanks to the Office of Sponsored Research, I was able to take students before I had my own study abroad program to a papal audience and to study pilgrimage in Italy on my research on Padre Pio as a Catholic saint. And then I have, up until COVID, a pretty successful, longstanding ethnographic field school in Perugia, where we study sustainable food and cultural heritage. And I think it was like October 2019, or right before COVID, I actually gave a talk on engaging student faculty research on a study abroad program. Like I said, this is actually a co-edited. I really like editing volumes, and I tend to produce them quite regularly. I like collaborating. I like to co-edit them as well. And in this one, I collaborated with John Bodinger Uriarte, who's he might be here actually, I don't know. But he's the chair of the Department of Anthropology at Susquehanna, but also had been heavily involved in Susquehanna's GO program. So GOES is really interesting if you're interested in study abroad. Susquehanna requires that, it's a small liberal arts private college in Pennsylvania, but they require all students to study away. So it could be short term, really short term, it could be medium term or long term, and it can be domestic as well as foreign travel. So a student can do a semester with the Amish. The point though is capturing the same kind of sense that study abroad has, which is to get you out of your comfort zone, change it up, engage with otherness to try to learn in a very visceral way. So it was a pleasure collaborating with him, and also all of the contributors, all of whom picked out different practices or issues or elements within the study abroad process that could be helpful also to other people. It's not a how-to book. It's more about ethnographic research, but there's environmental research, sustainability, social sustainability, volunteerism, and that kind of stuff. Really, for us, so COVID really did impact obviously the study abroad, and I'm sure a lot of you share my sentiment that I was devastated when I heard that my study abroad program I had almost 30 students on it, I think, and for this past summer was canceled. I argued with Vishal, came and talked to my dean, about, when it was first starting, of course. Then it became, a pretty serious, obviously, affair. And of course, I'm also very elated that the university just said that they're hoping, pending any other problems, that we'll have study abroad again, not this summer, but the spring semester after that. So I think right now it's a really an ideal time to rethink study abroad. So I want to go through a couple of points in the book and post COVID, that could maybe even kind of help people as they rethink their programs or put in new programs to do. We were ready to go to press literally in March of 2020, and then it got sidelined. And actually, that was a little bit of a boon maybe for us, because we had all of our in that interim when nothing was happening, including the publication of the book. We actually asked all of our contributors to about by June, July, to tell us how their study abroad program was affected. And we wrote actually a very nice epilogue, very thorough, one of the first ones about study abroad in the post-COVID era, about where how COVID affected study abroad, how and where can we go from there. And I'll touch on that very briefly at the end. So why study abroad? Why, for example, does John's Susquehanna make everybody study away or study abroad? And the first thing really to talk about is kind of defining it. And there's a lot of different definitions, a lot of different ways, especially at Westchester, that people interpret study abroad. But in essence, I've defined it as a form of mobility in which students voluntarily and temporarily travel elsewhere. That has to be off campus and most often outside of their familiar cultural settings and formal educational institution to supplement their education through cross-cultural learning. So a couple of key points: students. Of course, it doesn't have to be college students. It could be anyone engaged in formal learning. On my program with Westchester, I've taken continuing ed and non-traditional students. I've run as a tour operator. I've run high school study abroad. I was in 8th grade and whatever in elementary, middle school when I was doing it and taking classes with the college kids when the program my mom ran. But really, it's about not getting a degree in that place. It's not like migrating to Westchester to get a degree and saying you're studying abroad or something like that. There's, of course, a couple problems with the abroad phrase because, it's Hawaii abroad. We treat kind of Hawaii differently than Canada, for example. Certainly Canada is closer than, or going to Alabama might be very different than studying abroad in Toronto from here. And so, things like that we kind of discuss as well. Another issue is the voluntary and temporary aspect. I think it's really, really very important to understand that, because on the one hand, it falls into the main concept of our book that tourism is presented as study abroad is presented as kind of an anti-touristic experience. And I'll talk about that in a second. But that it's situated among other forms of leisure time mobility. And for whatever we say, we want to say that it's not tourism, we utilize the same infrastructures. And we've seen this with COVID as well. The same transportation infrastructure, same food chains, the same hotel infrastructures, those kinds of marketing infrastructures, all of those kinds of things that even though we try to differentiate ourselves from mass tourism, at the same time, we're very reliant on the same forms of infrastructure. The same exact thing, and I've given talks on how pilgrimage has been affected in the post-COVID era. Same thing there. Pilgrims don't want to say that they're tourists. That's the last thing they want to say. They are better than tourists. They're at a higher purpose, all that other stuff, but they're just as affected because they're using the same processes and structures. The elsewhere thing, as I said, really important that it's outside of one's comfort zone. And I think that's a really important aspect for this kinds of high impact learning that study abroad is, because not only do you learn about others in a very visceral way, and it fosters intercultural communication and what people call global citizenship, but it kind of answers that anthropological truism that you often can learn more about yourself by studying other people, right? It's easier to define yourself by who you're not than who you are. And it makes people, when confronted with alterity and otherness, it makes the students kind of stop and say, oh my God, they do things differently. It's so strange. But wait, it makes me think about why I think that it's normal that I'm doing the same practice in the same way. I think it's one of the biggest learning lessons outside of all those student outcomes, whatever the class that you're teaching is the fact that they are confronted with this alterity, this otherness. I think that's the really, really important pedagogical aspect. Of course, we like to make a big deal about the internationalization aspect or fostering global citizenship. It's a very controversial term, I'll say, because it's a very marketing businessy term. Do we really thought people really, do they really think of themselves as citizens of the world? We hope that they are recognizing cultural difference, an awareness of current events and how they play a part in that event. Those are kinds of the concepts involved in global citizenship. That's something that we push a lot at Westchester University in our study abroad programs. But of course, it's a very much a high impact educational practice, very common, educational kind of term. By Q, it demands that students devote considerable time and effort to purposeful tasks. And of course, being abroad, you can't go home at the end of the day. You can't shut your Zoom off. You are a lot of time and effort. It makes you think about these purposeful tasks you're doing. It puts you in circumstances that maybe you must interact meaningfully with other people to survive even, or to get by. Engages students in diversity, of course, and opens students' eyes to how learning works in different settings, including, humanizes the professor in many ways. You're seeing me all the time. You see me in a different light as well, especially as I run a field school, so I teach them methods, and they see me as the anthropologist, not as the anthropology teacher. So what does anti-tourism mean? It's basically a perception, right? That a lot of practitioners and also the actual travelers themselves try to take that somehow their travel stands in opposition to, and actually might be an antidote to, the perceived ills of stereotypical mass tourism. So if tourism is fast, superficial, staged, uninformed, socially destabilizing, commodified, leisure-oriented, study abroad we like to promote as being slower, authentic, deeper, immersive, educational, interactive, even though it's still a commodity, not a commodity. It's about learning and putting effort in. You got to study. You're studying abroad. How much studying goes on in a study abroad program? Really, I don't know. And I, in my own, one of my chapters, I talk about study abroad being really the optimal midpoint among a spectrum of different types of travel that also posit themselves as anti-touristic. And of course, I don't have time to go through all that, but on the one real end is that pilgrimage. You're coming into contact with the divine. You're changing. You're being in the all this kind of stuff. You're earning merit, miracles, that kind of stuff. And towards the spectrum, you have stuff like voluntourism or volunteerism or service learning, where you're still being. It's a very meaningful type of travel, supposedly. So on and so forth, to the very far end, where it's ethnography, this qualitative research or immersed participant observation, and so on and so forth. So when we're planning study abroad, or things that are touched on in the book, are a number of issues, a number of ethical considerations. I'm very big onto the ethics of study abroad. The first one, of course, is environmental sustainability. I mean, I teach a sustainability class abroad, and yet we have high carbon footprints to travel to Italy. Let's be honest. So how, what are some of the issues involved in that? I have a research grant with Paul Sylvester about how to mitigate carbon footprints in study abroad. And I should plug also the museum exhibit is opening on Earth Day as well. So whenever we're actually open, please come to a library, to the Museum of Anthropology, to see a lot of this stuff. But you pay for carbon offsets. Can you trust that provider? My own opinion is that, paying for RECs or carbon offsets, you're really just kind of pushing the problem away. But other people have other thoughts on that. You get to keep polluting and just pay it off, so it's for the rich. How long? One of my colleagues who contributed to this book, Jennifer Kaufman, has an incredible scientific study. She's an anthropologist, environmental scientist, on calculating how much your carbon footprint is, let's say at Westchester, versus how much it is in your trip to Rwanda, and how long you would have to stay in country to mitigate, to offset, because obviously it's going to be lower in that country, the flight over, for example. And so that's something that I urge everybody to think about. The problem, one of the biggest problems, and I don't want to, insult anybody who does a study abroad program, but more and more, especially at Westchester, but abroad, along the whole spectrum at universities in America, more and more these study abroad programs become so short that they are, week-long mass tour, Rome, Florence, Venice kind of a thing. It has very little, there is education, it's more like educational tourism like I used to run. It's high carbon footprint. Do we need that? Can we stay longer and stay in one place, maybe to mitigate those footprints? How can we make it more ecologically sustainable? Service learning is a big aspect of a lot of study abroad programs. A lot of people wrote about it in the book. There are a lot of problems with volunteerism. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a bad thing, but the debate is open on things like, does it really monetarily help the host community? Tourism in general, study abroad, everything. There's a lot of vertical integration, right? So that means that the tour operators a lot of that profit is being taken up by the tourism or study abroad organizer, and less trickles down into the actual host community. It's also costly for the host community. They have to feed you, they have to do all these things, and then we have to think about do the students who have very little basis in construction of houses, for example, do they have the credentials to do that? There are a lot of stories of, after the students leave, the locals rip down the house and set it up again for the next group to come as well. So yes, it might benefit the students because it does engage you in that high impact learning experience, but it does have some burdens for the host community. That being said, COVID has really shown a light on the fact that even though it is in many ways very burdensome for hosts, they are very dependent on us. Many are very dependent, and they're really suffering right now because we don't have travelers and students there. Another thing is education. How do the students really forge relationships? What kind of learning really does go on there as well? I do a lot of faculty-led research over there. I'm on the IRB committee, so don't hate me, but but again, I make them take the city certification, but I add them to my IRB that's already existing. Do they really have a grasp on all of the ethics of this project? We do talk about it before we leave. Do we let them be responsible for their own conduct? How much should we expect that they actually do a really good a research project? We're here for 5-6 weeks, better than 2 weeks, but still 6 weeks for an ethnographic project that's taking me years to do, maybe not, who knows? And then one of the things I love to talk about, but I don't want to spend too much time, is the very difficult position of the professor. We are not only the professor on these trips, as anybody who's led a study abroad program knows. We're the tour organizer and director. We're the marketer. We're the tour guide, right? We're the chief risk officer. We're the educator, the researcher, the parent. We're doing all of these things at one time. And oftentimes you get these very moral conflicts, For example, one of my colleagues, who's an anthropologist, an Israeli anthropologist, as well as a tour guide, he often says, as a professor, my job is to educate. As a tour guide, it's to provoke. And are those the same pedagogical things, for example? We also often have these concepts of what is our relationship with our people in our field site. I want to do the best and protect my students, but if they're insulting or something else with people that I have much longer standing relations and I rely on them from year to year, how do I balance those two? How do I stick up for my students, but also still privilege or help out or continue to cultivate those networks that I have there? Because they're also important for my research, as well as many of them are very close friends from when I was a kid going in. And finally, because I'm sure I'm over 8 minutes, but the effect of COVID. It's no surprise, right, that the main countries that were affected early on by COVID are the main tourism countries and the main providers of study abroad. The infrastructures are related. COVID spread into a pandemic through travel infrastructure. The first tourists going from Asia into Europe, and then Europe into America were tourists. That was primarily how COVID spread, and study abroad does the same thing. We had, when talking with the effects of COVID on different contributors' study abroad programs, there was the one thing that they all talked about were the problem of their obligations. They felt obligated to their students, right? How can I still deliver something similar that we promised, even though we are all in lockdown and quarantine? But also, like I said, to providers, my good friends have been let out of business. Those who are study abroad, in-country study abroad providers. One of our contributors works for an American study abroad program in Italy. She had to be laid off, right? There's no kids coming. There's no way that she could do this. So how are they affected? Whether or not we want to agree that these things, it's commodified or whatever, there's still people are relying on that source of income from our students and from our programs over the years. And not even to talk about our international students at Westchester who can't come back and all that other stuff. And finally, last, there are two responses that I've seen. And of course, this is a constantly evolving thing. One was at first, we got to stop and then return as usual. And another one is to take time to rethink study abroad. Business schools and those people in the tourism, marketing, all that stuff, they want to see how they can, often in a lot of my listservs and stuff, they're talking about how can we use similar models, tweak it a little bit, but use similar models. Whereas some, especially social scientists of the liberal bent, are often saying, this is the perfect opportunity. We've had basically a 1.5 year shutdown of all travel. Let's take the time to rethink our sustainability here, rethink how we treat socially and environmentally, treat our hosts. So for the importance of being there, so then there's two schools of that. Is it important to be there? Right? I've had lots of conversations with Vishal, with other people at university about whether or not you need to be there to deliver the student learning outcomes that you need, right? And so there's really two perspectives here. One is it about the student outcomes, or is it about being there, viscerally experiencing study abroad, right? And if you say, like I do, that the importance is actually the mobility, is to go there, you learn by encountering otherness. Now we have all these other new issues coming up. The Americans will be vaccinated way before any other country, for the most part. So do we have vaccine passports that privileging the wealthy people from wealthier countries that produce vaccines? What happens to the host community? Is it, all of these kinds of social problems, new social problems are coming up. And then of course, there's the issue of how much interaction are you going to have when you're there? What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? And then, like Gareth Barkin and others in my book, people say, you know what, study abroad is still pedagogy, and we should be thinking of pedagogically different ways to deliver the same student learning outcomes, to make them global citizens without getting off from our bedrooms here. I'm in my son's bedroom, right? I can study abroad from the comfort of my own home, right? Do we even need to travel? What can virtual study abroad give you? My own perspective, and this is it, I'm done, but is that it's important to be there. I think the visceral interaction is very important. There is a high carbon footprint. There are a lot of problems that we can certainly think about how we can maybe integrate virtual and non-virtual forms within an overarching, within some sort of a travel-oriented thing, because you really need to spend time away from campus in order to do that. So thank you. Sorry, I'm sure I went over, but
thank you, Michael. Can I do, while we get ready to wrap up, can we revisit kind of your process you went through for getting published? Michael, Bessie, and Marila, if you can all kind of pitch in if there's anything, a new process that maybe Crystal and Chris didn't touch on.
What I would say is networking is important. Basically, Anita and I got the invitation to even talk to a publisher through a colleague from another university. And this was at one of the conferences, academic conferences. So there are publishers in those conferences. It's always useful to go to the textbook publishers hall, I guess. In our conference, it's always this big hall, and just talk to the publishers and ask them what they're interested in and what are the steps to initiate something like this.
Oh, you're on mute, Marila.
I've had a similar experience to Bessie. I've published 2 books, and the first one was an invited book by a publisher who attended a presentation that I and my co-author gave at a professional conference. And the book that I talked about today is a book that my co-editor and I proposed to a publishing company, and we were required to do some homework with respect to generating some data to indicate a community of interest in the book. We were asked to find people who would, at a faculty level, who would support the need for this book. So those are 2 different sorts of roads to publication.
Did you need me to say, Crystal, did you talk, you said that already?
Crystal shared after hers.
I did, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I agree with everybody. I mean, there's lots of different perspectives. Certainly at conferences, they have, usually publishers have their booths, even virtual booths. And so if you aren't familiar with different publishers, definitely go through there. There are really 2 or 3 kinds of different publishers that publish our stuff. There's there are the academic presses, right? So the colleges, and they usually seem to have more prestige. They're more geared towards these kinds of books. Got to look, they're really, a lot of these academic presses are really thinking outside the box. I mean, University of Toronto Press, and I have a book coming out with them, are doing a lot of these insight volumes, so very short volumes that are well priced, that are only like $20 for soft cover, those kinds of things. They're doing also graphic novel versions as well in their anthropology series. So those are all great, and they do seem to be a little prestigious, although some of them can be kind of snobby. But you shouldn't beware. You should try it, you send it. The worst that can happen is you get rejected. Or you can kind of look at some of these academic presses, like the Routledge, Taylor and Francis, the Sage, Rowman Littlefield, Kendall Hunt. I have my exhibit catalogs are all published by Kendall Hunt. They have a slightly different publishing model as well. And then of course there's a popular press as well. And it's just, you should try to look at what, if there's a fit for things, right? So different presses, especially the academic press, are going to have different specialties. If you're writing on Latin American migration, University of Texas Press, right? Or University of California Press specialize in those kinds of things, because those are the types of things that the university really pushes. So you got to kind of look at that. If they're a book series, that's good too. And again, like we said before, publish in a chapter, network at conferences, and really just I always tell people, you just take a chance, right? The worst that can happen is that you get rejected. But the one other thing is that look first before you submit about what they want to submit, right? They usually say what kind of proposal that they want. Like University of Chicago Press wants a full manuscript. They don't want to mess around, or anything like that. Whereas we look for, in our series, we look for, a thorough prospectus with a couple writing samples, a CV, and you have to fill out a form and things like that. So do that. That is and check it over. I've gotten proposals where it's full of errors. I'm not going to publish a book of yours if you can't write a 4-page proposal without errors. Go to Eleanor Shevlin and have them look at your proposal first, something like that. So.
Great, thank you. As we wrap up, just again, a quick plug. Michael just mentioned it and Eleanor put it in the Q&A. WordWorks, reach out to Eleanor if you need some help with a proposal. She would be a great resource. So thank you to all of our speakers, sharing your books, your work, your passions. I think this was helpful and hopefully will spark some interest with other faculty to begin publishing. So thank you.
Thank
I look forward to have more forums next year.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.